This podcast is sponsored by the online course, Intro to Psychology, with Dr. Bo Bennett, PhD. Uncover the secrets of the human mind and transform your life at introtopsych.com. Start your journey today.
Experimental psychology applications you didn't know impact your life. Discover how experimental psychology shapes everyday decisions, behavior, and fields like education and marketing in this easy-to-understand overview. Hey, let's chat about experimental psychology and its surprising real-world uses. So imagine you're sitting down with a friend over coffee, and the topic swings over to psychology, that fascinating mix of how people think, feel, and act. If you've ever wondered at how scientists actually study the human mind in a controlled way, then experimental psychology is the name of the game. Today I want to share some cool insights about experimental psychology applications and why they matter beyond just textbooks and lab coats. Experimental psychology, at its core, is about designing experiments that test various psychological concepts, things like memory, perception, learning, and decision-making. It's really the foundation behind a lot of the psychology theories we hear about in an Intro to Psychology course or Psychology 101 classes. But the exciting part? These experiments don't just stay in labs, they inform real-world practices across so many fields. What exactly does experimental psychology look like? Experimental psychologists usually create scenarios to observe how people respond. Think about classic experiments, like Pavlov's dogs or the Stroop test. These aren't just stories, they're carefully crafted studies that tell us how conditioning and attention work. When you reflect on those studies, it's easy to see how these discoveries form the backbone for broader psychological knowledge and help shape how we approach everything from education to mental health treatment. But the magic isn't just in the experiments themselves, it's in how the findings get applied. And that's what I find most exciting when talking about psychological concepts. Practical applications that affect your everyday life. Clinical psychology, many therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, owe a lot to experimental research on how thoughts influence behavior. Understanding how people process information and change habits comes straight from lab findings. Education. Teachers use principles discovered in experiments to improve learning methods. For example, research on memory and attention helps in designing better study techniques and classroom environments. If you're interested in psychology education, you'll recognize this immediately. Workplace behavior. Experimental research on motivation and decision-making influences how companies motivate employees, manage stress, and foster teamwork. Marketing and consumer behavior. Ever notice how advertisements seem to speak directly to you? Marketers use psychological theories from experiments about perception and persuasion to shape their campaigns. Human factors and ergonomics. Design of products and interfaces often relies on how experimental psychologists understand human attention and cognition, making everything from smartphones to car dashboards more user-friendly. Why should you care about experimental psychology? One reason is that it gives you a lens to understand human behavior better, beyond just guessing why people do what they do. It's scientific, evidence-based, and it helps remove biases and myths. You might remember some of this if you've taken an Intro to Psychology course like the Intro to Psychology course by Dr. Bo Bennett on the Verversity.com platform. Such courses break down complicated psychological topics in a way that's not just educational but also pretty engaging. Plus, knowing how experiments shape these psychological concepts can improve your critical thinking. It encourages you to question how data is gathered and interpreted, which is pretty relevant in today's information-heavy world. Some interesting examples of experimental psychology in action. The bystander. Effect. Experimental studies showed that people are less likely to help someone in need when others are around, because they assume someone else will act. This insight changes how we think about emergency response and public awareness campaigns. Memory studies. Experiments on how memories form and fade have led to better techniques in both therapy for trauma and in educational settings to help students retain information. Social psychology experiments. Classic studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment or Milgram's Obedience Study, though ethically controversial now, have been pivotal in understanding authority, conformity, and human behavior under pressure. Attention research. findings on how distraction affects performance have influenced policies about texting and driving, and how workplaces design spaces to improve productivity. Wrapping this up, why it's worth exploring. All in all, experimental psychology isn't just another dry academic subject confined to labs or textbooks. It's an active, evolving field that directly impacts how we teach, work, heal, and interact. If you've ever been curious about psychology topics ranging from how memory works to why people behave certain ways, understanding experimental psychology gives you a stronger foundation to appreciate all those theories and concepts. And if you want a solid start to understanding this fascinating field, I highly recommend checking out the Intro to Psychology course by Dr. Bo Bennett on the Verversity.com platform. It's a great way to learn about psychological concepts with clear examples and practical applications. Enroll now to understand human behavior better and see how the science of psychology plays out in everyday life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or just someone curious about how your mind works, this course will open doors you didn't know existed.